We had a very interesting segment on the toxicity. I clarified things for me. I really enjoyed that session. And now we're over to the other minerals that you show, but there is not really a lot of information or relevance because they're not essential minerals. What could you tell us about other
Yes,
elements?
this will be discussing some of the additional elements in the this part of the graph that is in a green area, and here we also have the reference intervals that is found with these minerals, and these are really considered trace or ultra trace elements.
Okay.
And how well known they are as far as their function in the human body and the cellular function, and that is much less than what we know about the nutritional elements and the heavy metals. But we do have a reference interval for each of these elements as well, and the dark green on the low side and the dark green on the high side would represent, you know, a low level and a high level, and the reference interval is right here in between. And so we do have we do have the reference interval for them, what we find, you know, commonly in individuals. But what exactly do they mean when we find them in the hair on the low side? You know, we don't necessarily know that.
Okay.
What does it mean when we find them in the hair on the high side? The main thing is that if it's excessively high, then you'd want to look for a potential source and try to modify that, because they could be adversely impacting the body to some degree. But many of these elements here, you know, they correspond and move with the nutritional elements.
Okay.
You know, for example, let's take rubidium here. Rubidium is, you know, almost identical to potassium. And so typically when we see a low potassium, we'll see low rubidium. And when we see an elevated potassium, then we'll see an elevated rubidium.
Okay.
And someone might think, well, my rubidium is excessively high, it's toxic because it's high.
Right.
And that would be secondarily elevated due to the potassium.
Right.
And once the potassium is reduced, then the rubidium is reduced. Same way with strontium. For example, strontium follows calcium. It's so closely related to calcium, and it deposits in the same area. So when we see a person with a high calcium level, their strontium will typically be high, and it's not a toxicity necessarily, it's just following up and down with calcium. And how high does it have to be before it's toxic remains to be seen.
Okay, so there is nothing alarming about how these move. It's the alarm will show here.
In a sense, you know, we do know the relationship between and among the additional elements relative to the nutritional elements, which we show on the graph here of additional ratios. And this is basically showing the expected values of the known relationship among those ultra traces and the nutrient mineral. For example, you know, we'll have potassium to lithium on here, and we know that the ratio should be about 2,500 to 1. In other words, the amount of potassium relative to lithium should be about 2,500 to 1. So if that becomes extremely low, then that means that lithium could be having an adverse impact on potassium status, and so something needs to be you know, done to address that. For example, tin we know to be highly to cause free radical, and we know that the zinc and tin are mutually antagonistic to each other, as well as selenium and tin, and that helps to reduce the free radical generation from it. Now, cautionary discussion should be made as well on some of these elements, because you can have an issue with an external contaminant. For example, you mentioned earlier that you find elevated tin levels in a lot of individuals in Scandinavia, and I think you probably find that most commonly in women than you do men.
Okay.
But you can find it in both. But a lot of times this can be artificially elevated. The tin can be artificially elevated due to a hair treatment, peroxide, hydrogen peroxide, because tin is a stabilizer and peroxide forming. So we do see that artificially elevated. So when we see a high 10, you know, if they have a history of that use, then we would not put any clinical significance on it. But if there is no use, then you might need to say, okay, what are potential sources of 10?
Okay, that's a good point.
That you may have. And then, of course, lithium, you know, we typically rarely ever see high lithium levels unless it's occurring naturally in the water. Or a person has been on lithium therapy.
Right, that's what I was thinking about.
Right.
How do you see any adverse effects of using lithium?
Yes, lithium is well known to have adverse effects in long-term use. It tends to contribute to thyroid disorders, parathyroid disorders, diabetes, and so on. And so when we see a high level and a person has a clinical history of using it and have symptomatology, then they may want to evaluate that. And you can sort of use this as an indication of what a person might be taking from a herbal standpoint. Many herbal compounds will have high levels naturally occurring of these items, and it's not necessarily lithium therapy per se, it just happens to be present in some of those herbs, and same way with germanium. And you also mentioned another one, bismuth, earlier, that it can frequently be seen elevated, and bismuth is a compound that is commonly found in gastric antacids. Bismuth is used as a treatment for Helicobacter, or H. pylori, I should say. It's a bacterial infestation in the small intestine, and bismuth aids in combating that, but it's also present in common antacids and Pepto-Bismol particularly. And then it's also common in cosmetics. Women, you know, using various types of cosmetics could inadvertently contaminate the hair sample with those cosmetics.
That's normally what I think of. I think of cosmetics when I see that high. But, but now I know it also can be caused by gastric.
Right. And then the other one here, nickel, of course, you know, that's one of the most common metals associated with dermatitis, you know, dermatological conditions due to contact with metals. And so when we see a high nickel level, you know, certainly in a person who's symptomatic of contact dermatitis or metal sensitivity, that might be something to look at relative to their exposure. And then, of course, platinum, you know, platinum is, you know, a precious metal, but it's a heavy metal. And you can see that elevated in some of the cisplatin therapies for cancer. And then, of course, platinum can become very toxic and cause neurological conditions and so forth. Then thallium, of course, the most common source of that is, you know, rodenticides, rat poisoning, and that type of thing.
All right. Very interesting. Thank you very much, Dave.
You're welcome.